They moved after midnight, not in convoys, not under flags, not in anything that wanted to be seen. A small boat slipped out from the Cuban coast and pointed north toward the United States, their hulls riding low in the water, engines controlled, lights cut, radios quiet. From a distance, they looked like nothing more than shadows skimming across the sea. But beneath tarps, under bait boxes, inside false compartments sealed into fiberglass and metal, the cargo was packed tight. Narcotics heading for the American coast. Every mile north increased the value. Every wave, every patrol pattern, every shift of wind could mean profit, prison, or death. The men on those boats did not need speeches. They knew the route. They knew the stakes. Cuba behind them, Florida ahead. Between the two, 90 miles of dark water and one of the most dangerous smuggling corridors in the hemisphere. This was not romance. It was logistics. Fuel measured carefully, weight distributed precisely, engines modified for speed, cargo hidden for inspection, timetables built around moonlight, radar gaps, and the confidence that someone onshore was waiting with cash, trucks, and silence. In these waters, the crossing was never just about getting from one coast to another. It was about moving through the seam where organized crime, geopolitics, and black market survival met in darkness. Night falls fast over the Florida Straits. One moment, the sea is steel blue under the last light of sunset. The next, it becomes a black plain of moving glass, broken only by moonlight and the faint pulse of distant engines. Somewhere beyond that darkness lies Cuba. To the north, barely 90 miles away, the coast of the United States. Between them, one of the most strategic stretches of water on Earth, a corridor of wind, salt, politics, and secrets. For centuries, the Caribbean had been a region of contraband long before modern narcotics entered the picture. Sugar, rum, tobacco, weapons, and human beings once moved across these waters under false papers and hidden cargo. The geography itself encouraged it. Too many islands, too many coves, too many places for a boat to vanish between official maps and the reality of the shoreline. Smuggling was not an exception in the Caribbean. It was part of its bloodstream. By the 20th century, that old smuggler's geography had found a new commodity: drugs. The story was never simple. It was never a single route, a single cartel, or a single government conspiracy. It was a web, built from traffickers, informants, exiles, corrupt officials, opportunists, fishermen, dock workers, and men who could read both politics and tides. Cuba occupied a uniquely powerful place in that web, not always as the center, but often as a shadow at the edge of every map. Too close to Florida to ignore, too politically explosive to discuss casually, too useful, at times, for too many different players. In the years before the Cuban Revolution, Havana was already infamous. It glittered in the 1940s and 1950s as a tropical extension of American vice. A city of casinos, hotels, rum, music, and organized crime. American mob figures saw Cuba not simply as a paradise, but as infrastructure. A place where money could be laundered, deals could be struck, and shipments could move through the blur between legality and indulgence. Tourists saw glamour. Gangsters saw lanes of access. Politicians saw revenue. Beneath the chandeliers and neon, the city learned the mechanics of international vice. Then came 1959. Fidel Castro's revolution did not merely change a government. It detonated an entire underworld order. Mafia
Look, I'm
networks
tired.
lost influence.
I've told you everything I
American
know about the
investors
operation.
lost property.
We need protection.
Intelligence agencies lost predictability.
Queremos dejar claro que las
Exiles fled
acusaciones
north.
son
Havana,
completamente falsas.
once open to American
Negamos
criminal
rotundamente
enterprise,
cualquier
was
implicación.
transformed into the capital of a hostile, revolutionary state sitting just off the US coastline. But geography did not change. Cuba
If you
was
compare the
still Cuba.
manifests with these
The
photographs,
sea
Your Honor,
remained
it becomes
open.
clear the
The
shipments
routes
detailed in these
remained possible.
transcripts are the ones intercepted.
In the decades that followed, the Caribbean became one of the great narcotics corridors into the United States. Cocaine production surged in South America, especially in Colombia. Demand in the US rose into a vast consumer market, and traffickers looked for every available channel through the Bahamas, through Puerto Rico, through Central America, through Mexico, and through waters near or around Cuba. The island's location made it impossible to separate from the wider story of smuggling in the region, even when the evidence was fragmented, disputed, or buried under Cold War propaganda. This is what made the subject so dangerous. Every fact moved inside politics. During the Cold War, nearly every accusation involving Cuba and narcotics was entangled with intelligence warfare. Anti-Castro exiles made claims. US agencies investigated. Havana denied involvement. Defectors surfaced with stories that were sometimes credible, sometimes inflated, sometimes impossible to verify cleanly. In Washington, any sign that narcotics might intersect with a communist state 90 miles from Florida carried strategic weight far beyond the crime itself. In Havana, any accusation could be dismissed as part of a broader campaign of destabilization. The truth, when it appeared, often came in fragments: court testimony, intercepted shipments, intelligence leaks, the sudden arrest of men who knew too much. Yet the mechanics of smuggling were brutally concrete. Fast boats ran low and hard across dark water, engines muffled until they no longer needed to be. Fishing vessels carried hidden compartments beneath ordinary decks. Cargo moved inside false fuel tanks, sealed containers, and hollowed structures disguised as harmless maritime equipment. Pilots flew low across the Caribbean night, sometimes dropping loads to waiting boats, sometimes vanishing from radar altogether. A successful shipment depended less on cinematic, daring than on routine precision, timing, silence, fuel, weather, and the confidence that someone on shore was waiting. Miami became one of the great receiving points of this age. In the 1970s and 1980s, South Florida was not just a city, but a frontier of money, migration, and narcotics. Cocaine profits poured into real estate, banks, nightclubs, used car lots, and shell businesses. Violence spiked. Assassinations, machine gun murders, and bombings became part of the urban rhythm. The city's skyline rose while blood dried in parking lots. It was one of the most dramatic collisions of modern capitalism and organized crime in American history. And always, just beyond the horizon, lay Cuba. Sometimes as obstacle, sometimes as suspicion, sometimes as territory near which traffickers operated because geography offered little choice, sometimes as a state accused of tolerating or facilitating narcotics movements, and sometimes as a government that publicly claimed to be fighting it. The ambiguity was not accidental. Ambiguity was useful. In the underworld, uncertainty protects everyone, until it doesn't. One of the most explosive chapters came in the late 1980s. General Arnaldo Ochoa, a decorated Cuban military hero, along with Interior Ministry official Jose Abrantes and others, became central figures in a dramatic Cuban state prosecution involving allegations of drug trafficking, corruption, and abuse of power. The trial was public, shocking, and politically charged. Ochoa was convicted and executed in 1989. The Cuban government presented the case as proof that it punished corruption at the highest levels. Critics outside Cuba saw something darker, perhaps a real scandal, perhaps also a purge, perhaps a warning shot fired inward at the state itself. The deeper truth may have contained both crime and politics, fused together so tightly that separating them became almost impossible. That is the nature of contraband history in the Caribbean. It rarely arrives clean. Around the same time, US authorities intensified interdiction efforts across the region. Radar networks expanded, Coast Guard patrols increased, informants multiplied, federal agents tracked routes through the Bahamas, the Florida Keys, and the Yucatan Channel. Every new enforcement effort pushed traffickers to adapt. Smuggling routes do not disappear under pressure, they bend. When one corridor becomes dangerous, another opens. The sea teaches flexibility better than any school. Meanwhile, ordinary people living along these coasts often found themselves trapped between myth and survival. A fisherman with a small boat might be approached once and refuse or accept. A dock worker might notice unusual cargo and say nothing. A mechanic might repair engines for men whose money came in rolled cash and whose questions did not invite answers. In smuggling economies, complicity often spreads not through ideology, but through proximity. One favor, one silence, one envelope. The underworld does not always conquer communities by force. Sometimes it seeps into them like damp air. And still, the image persists. A moonlit speedboat cutting north from the Caribbean, spray exploding behind it, contraband sealed beneath fiberglass, US lights somewhere ahead. It is cinematic because it was real. But the deeper story is not the boat. It is the system that made the boat necessary. American demand, Caribbean geography, Cold War hostility, state corruption, poverty, exile politics, organized crime. Every shipment crossing those waters carried more than drugs. It carried history, colonial trade routes reborn in a modern form, old maritime knowledge repurposed for criminal logistics, political enmities layered over criminal markets. Cuba stood at the center of that tension, not merely because of what may have passed through or near its waters, but because it symbolized a larger contradiction. An island presented to the world as a revolutionary fortress existed beside one of the most lucrative illegal consumer markets on earth. Its leaders denounced imperial decadence while operating in a region saturated by smuggling networks. Its enemies accused it of complicity. Its government accused those enemies of fabrication. Across decades, the truth shifted with each witness, each archive, each defector, each sealed intelligence file. What remains constant is the sea. The Caribbean remembers everything and preserves almost nothing. Boats rot. Men disappear. Paper trails dissolve. What survives are fragments, seizure records, trial transcripts, rumors passed through ports, names scratched into investigative files, stories traded by retired agents and old smugglers who speak in half-truths because half-truths kept them alive. In the end, the story of Cuba, narcotics, and the United States is not a neat tale of villains and heroes. It is a story of proximity, of an island and a superpower staring at each other across 90 miles of water while money, ideology, and contraband move through the dark between them. Of a coastline where politics met profit. Of a region where the oldest law was not written in any constitution, but in the practical logic of the tide. Where there is demand, someone will cross, and on certain nights, when the water is calm and the wind is low, the Florida Straits still look deceptively peaceful. Just moonlight on black water, just the hush of distance. But history knows better. Those waters carried empires, exiles, revolutionaries, gun runners, dreamers, and traffickers. And for decades, under the cover of darkness, they carried the shadow economy of a hemisphere